What links this with this? On the surface, these pieces may seem completely different, but if you keep watching, you'll find out just how much they have in common. During his lifetime, Erik Satie was not particularly well regarded as a composer. He had unique and often eccentric music, which largely failed to resonate with an audience that was accustomed to serious romanticism, the likes of Wagner and Brahms. Critics of the time saw potential in Satie's music, but they ultimately concluded that his compositions lacked substance. However, since Satie's death, his music has received recognition from all kinds of composers and critics. John Cage, in particular, cites him as a key influence in his work. Erik Satie's furniture music was a genre composed specifically to be ignored. It essentially gave us the modern idea of background music, and thus Satie influenced the creation of one of the most divisive styles of music to ever exist, Muzak. As the name suggests, Satie's furniture music was designed to be functional, rather like a piece of furniture. A chair, for example, is not usually something that you would pay a great deal of attention to. If it is doing its job well, it's likely to blend into the environment, allowing for other things to absorb the user's attention. Satie wanted his music to do the same, to simply contribute to the atmosphere of a scenario, rather than inviting the close, concert hall-oriented listening that was standard for classical music at the time. So how did furniture music come to be? Well, Satie's friend, the painter Fernand Léger, recalls that Satie first came up with this idea of furniture music after being subjected to some unbearable, vulgar music as the two ate lunch together. When they left the restaurant, Satie said, "Furniture music is something that should be created. That is, music which would be part of the ambience, which would take account of it. I imagine it being melodic in nature. It would soften the noise of knives and forks without dominating them, without imposing itself. It would furnish those silences which sometimes hang heavy between the diners. It would save them from everyday banalities. And at the same time, it would neutralize those street sounds which impinge on us indiscreetly." The idea of background music, music which was not meant to be fully, attentively listened to, is familiar to us today. There's film music, minimalism, ambient music, many forms of popular music, and, of course, there's shopping center Muzak, and these all function as background music in some way. There are even countless background music playlists on streaming platforms like Spotify. But in 1917, when Satie first envisioned a music that was specifically designed to be ignored, many within the Western art music tradition found this idea incompatible with what they believed music to be. Until this point, a key aspect of Western art music was its thematic development, which, in order to be fully appreciated, had to be listened to attentively, ideally in a concert hall. A great example of this is Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. The opening motif is woven throughout the rest of the score in many varied forms and contexts, providing the piece with its own inherent sense of musical logic and progression. And if you want to learn more about this piece, then you can watch one of my videos on it. For the music critic Theodor Adorno, this developing and repurposing of a motif is what gives that repetition meaning. Typically of Erik Satie, though, his furniture music did not comply whatsoever with this aesthetic. All of the published pieces of furniture music are very short compositions, and they are to be repeated ad lib for an unspecified amount of time. In Satie's mind, this could be hours of unvaried repetition of the same short passage of music, rendering his furniture music, at least by Adorno's logic, meaningless. And perhaps that was the point. For Satie, the lack of thematic development in his furniture music meant that it wasn't fully meaningful on its own. This music is contingent on another activity in order to function correctly as background music. In other words, just as thematically rich and complex art music only makes full sense when you listen to it attentively, furniture music only makes sense when it is listened to as background music and dominated by other activities. Satie's furniture music was purely functional and had no artistic value whatsoever, hence why he doesn't want you to actually listen to it. But furniture music wasn't Satie's only venture into incessant, unvaried repetition. Infamously, his piece Vexations, which was actually a precursor to furniture music, suggests that the performer should play the short piece a whopping 840 times. Vexations was never performed in Satie's lifetime, but John Cage staged a performance of it in 1963 with a relay team of 12 pianists. The performance went on for a total of 18 hours and 40 minutes. Tickets cost $5, and audience members were entitled to a refund of 5 cents for every 20 minutes that they endured. Cage himself admitted that he wasn't certain of the purpose of Vexations. Satie's instruction to repeat it 840 times may even have been a joke. But similarly to furniture music, the unvaried repetition induced a sense of stasis in the music, allowing the listener to have their attention absorbed by something else. And this is exactly what many of the audience members did that day. Some read, some ate, and some slept. Despite not knowing the exact reason for its existence, the audience seemed to gather that repetitive music could function as a background to other activities. Vexations was perhaps Satie's first musical experiment with completely unvaried repetition. And in the 24 years separating its composition and that of the first furniture pieces, Satie came to realize the value that it could have in cultivating background music. So let's take a closer look at a piece of furniture music to understand how Satie composed music that was designed to be ignored. This is Satie's Karalagephonic, which roughly translates to acoustic tiling. The title reflects the furniture-like function that this piece intends to have. And the extensive repetition of one or two motifs can be likened to the repeating visual motifs on a piece of wallpaper, for example. There is nothing remarkable about this piece's instrumentation, and it does not attempt to hide the simplicity of the music. This is an ensemble of 6 instruments, and there are only ever 2 melodic lines playing at any one time. The flute, first violin, viola, and cello all play the main melodic figure, while the clarinet and second violin accompany with a constant 8th note countermelody. The individual instruments blur into an undefinable timbre, with no single instrument standing out over the others. The harmony is simple, but it avoids the traditional tonic-dominant relationship that gives most functional music its sense of tension and release. Instead, it fosters a comparably motionless feeling in the music. Similarly, the incessant and unvaried repetition drains the piece of any sense of progression, reducing its interest and allowing it to simply fade into the background. To top it all off, Satie instructs for the music to be performed ordinaire or ordinary. This music is not supposed to be interesting. It is designed to be as ignorable as possible, allowing the receiver to have their attention dominated by another activity. So, what do you think? Do you find Karalagephonic to be suitable background music? Could you concentrate on what I was saying? Or did you find the incessant repetition to be too grating, too jarring to simply ignore? Our analysis of Satie's score displays his intention to write deliberately uninteresting, non-dominating music. But this does not necessarily guarantee its success as background music in reality. On the 8th of March 1920, the only public performance of a piece of furniture music in Satie's lifetime took place. Un Salon, which means a drawing room, was played in the interval of Max Jacobs' play Ruffian toujours, Tron jamais. Satie's friend and fellow composer Darius Milhaud infamously recalls, "Contrary to our instructions, as soon as the music started, the listeners hurried back to their seats, and Satie shouted in vain, 'Talk! Walk around, don't listen. They listened. They were quiet. It was a failure. Satie hadn't counted on his music's appeal. Perhaps this 1920s audience was not up to speed with Satie's progressive ideals on functional music, but clearly this distinction between attentive and inattentive listening is more blurred than Satie had first thought. However much Satie may have desired the opposite, the reality remains that background music can be listened to attentively. And likewise, autonomous art music can be listened to with a distracted state of mind. At 24 bars in length, Un Salon, which you have just heard playing in the background, is one of the longer pieces of furniture music. You may have noticed that Satie makes use of two musical quotations in this piece. Most obviously, there is Camille Saint-Saëns' Danse Macabre. But there was also a parry of Connais-tu le pays from Ambroise Thomas' opera Mignon. Aside from Satie somewhat disrespecting these composers by implying that their music is best consumed passively, the inclusion of these melodies shows a belief that a well-known, popular tune can help create inoffensive and thus inobtrusive background music. The tradition of using widely recognizable tunes in background music continued into Muzak, where the familiar melodies are chosen specifically to make the environment feel comfortable for shoppers and thus encourage them to spend more money. Satie did not use familiar melodies for economic gain, but like Muzak, he saw the value of them as easy listening. So, how well do you think Un Salon works as background music? If you noticed the borrowed tunes, did their familiarity help to make music easy to listen to? Did having something to latch onto in the music feel comforting? Or did the tunes stick out like a sore thumb and thus contradict the purpose of background music? Perhaps the background music works better for you when you're unfamiliar with the piece. For me, when I hear a tune that I recognize in a piece, I am more likely to pay attention to it. And perhaps this is part of the reason why the debut of Un Salon in 1920 did not go as Satie had planned. With his furniture music, Satie wanted to establish a musical genre to satisfy needs. As Satie said, art doesn't come into it. This is an incredibly bold and controversial statement for the early 1900s, and perhaps the world needed time to adjust to his ideas. About 50 years later, the president of the Muzak Corporation, as quoted by Hervé Vernal, explained that Muzak is not trying to get intellectual or emotional involvement any more than you do with air conditioning or the color of an office. Not only does this statement embrace the functional and non-artistic aspects of Muzak, but the comparisons of music to air conditioning or the color of a wall are strikingly similar to what Satie had to say about his furniture music roughly 50 years earlier. Furniture music creates vibrations. It has no other aims. It fulfills the same role as light, heat, and comfort in all its forms. But Muzak isn't the only form of background music to take inspiration from furniture music. It could be argued that, to some extent, film music could be a form of background music. Firstly, film music is not necessarily meant to be noticed by the viewers, but rather subconsciously absorbed, much like furniture music. Secondly, since the pioneering work of Max Steiner on films like Casablanca and King Kong, film scores have tended to contribute to the narrative by reflecting the emotion of a scene. Thus, just as furniture music does not make full sense without a dominating activity, film music may make less sense alone than it does when married up to the picture it was composed for. I dare say that some film soundtracks, if they were stripped of all context, would struggle to stand on their own 2 feet as pure music. It's worth mentioning that Satie did actually score 2 films himself, but his film scoring philosophy was wildly different to what is common today. Instead of writing music directly related to the narrative in order to heighten the storytelling, Satie's approach was to write music that was unrelated to and detached from the on-screen activities. In fact, his approach to film scoring was rather similar to his approach to furniture music. His score for René Clair's 1924 film Entr'acte is comprised of short, repeating blocks of music that appear to be totally devoid of emotion and musical purpose. Another form of background music that was likely inspired by Satie is the ambient music of Brian Eno, best exemplified in his album Ambient 1, Music for Airports. The title of this album is reminiscent of how Satie titled his furniture pieces, referring to a place that the music could be used in. Like Furniture Music and Muzak, Eno's ambient music is functional, yet he simultaneously intended to retain artistic integrity and value. As Eno says, whereas conventional background music is produced by stripping away all sense of doubt and uncertainty, and thus all genuine interest from the music, ambient music retains these qualities. In essence, Eno's ambient music aims to be interesting, but not dominating. It fuses the artistic ideals of romanticism with the functional uses of Muzak and Satie's furniture music. As Eno summarizes, ambient music must be able to accommodate many levels of listening attention, without enforcing one in particular. It must be as ignorable as it is interesting. Eno captures the actual reality of how many people listen to music, drifting between states of attention and distraction. Though he didn't receive great recognition in his lifetime, it's clear now just how influential Erik Satie and his furniture music were on the future of background music. For better or worse, Satie instigated a shift in the way that we listen to music, and we're still seeing the effects of this in our everyday lives. He may not have been a true artist in the romantic sense of the word, but he was certainly brave and determined enough to pioneer a musical tradition that he viewed as a social necessity. So, for Muzak, we have Satie to thank. Perhaps you don't want to be a musician. Perhaps you want to be a true, highly trained musician. If that's the case, you should check out the links on my website, which will teach you ear training, sight reading, writing, composing, music appreciation, and more. Thanks for supporting this channel.